Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. A podcast where we make experts great again and contribute actively to the public debate and policy making around commodities, the geopolitics of energy and trade. I'm Leslie Palti-Guzman. It's March 6, 2026, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today, my guest is Kevin Book, co-founder and director of research at ClearView Energy and Partners, and a new non-resident senior advisor at CSIS, the Center on Energy Security and Climate Change. And Kevin covers oil, gas, coal policy for institutional investors and corporate strategy. And we have a common connection through the Fletcher School because we both attended the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation given the context and the geopolitics of energy unfolding in front of our eyes. Just before we dive into the conversation, I have a small tech on my end. So the United States have launched a preventive military operation called Epic Fury and Roaring Lion against Iran to remove nuclear and missile threats before it was too late, rather than kicking the can down the road to their successors. Both countries calculated that there was a historical opportunity to take down the threat that posed by the Islamic regime. So the war goals include no nuclear bomb, no missiles, no MOLA. But I see also several indirect goals that may not have been articulated clearly by the Trump administration, maybe to avoid revealing too much to the adversaries. But one is that from Venezuela to Iran and from Russia to Cuba, we may be witnessing a broader strategy to break down what is called the rogue state axis. So these regimes have acted with relative impunity, while China had provided an economic lifeline, notably by purchasing sanctioned crude or providing non-Western technologies. And this permissive ecosystem has enabled sanction evasions, intelligence cooperation, and weapon transfers. So regime change in Iran could also weaken Iran's network of proxies, also from Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthi. And talking about the Houthi, that's the second maybe indirect goal, is that a goal, and I hope a success, could be to reopen the key sea lanes and restoration of freedom of navigation. So from the Strait of Hormuz to the Red Sea, we've seen right now that Western interests and commercial interests have really been taken hostage. So for nearly 3 years, the Houthi have disrupted a vital maritime corridor and have forced Western tankers and commercial shipments to reroute around Africa. So confronting Iran would allow the US and its partners to restore their authority in critical, vital, strategic maritime corridor. And it could also, basically restore the balance of power against those illicit networks and non-state actors, but also which at the end benefited China's economic warfare. And third, the US maybe tested its alliances and who is really a strategic, reliable partner and ally in this emerging global world order. So Israel remains an indispensable co-pilot in any Middle East security configuration, literally the best pilots, along with the US Top Guns pilots. But we see also that Ukraine is offering drones capabilities. So Ukraine has demonstrated new weaponries and defense capability against those drones that they are offering now maybe to the Gulf countries. We've seen that the Kurds are offering maybe boots on the ground. Interestingly, the Europeans are still trying to do a big split. And right now, if you are a European Navy and you're not helping with the Strait of Hormuz, maybe you have picked the wrong side. Or if you're a Gulf country and you have defensive capabilities and that you're not using, maybe also you're on the wrong side. So it's going to be a test of alliances. So in short, the geopolitical map of the Middle East and its energy flows could be entering a new phase, a new period of profound change. And let's turn to today's conversation. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Leslie. How are you?
Very good. I'm very happy you can join me today for what is clearly a timely discussion. So the ongoing war in Iran and the broader Middle East is likely to last for another 2-3 weeks, who knows? But Iran has already targeted 12 countries since Saturday, or even more, I think, since Azerbaijan also was hit, I think, yesterday. So more than 12 countries. Transit through the Strait of Hormuz has halted, sending shockwaves in the oil and gas markets. So what is your last read on the oil situation? Are we going to reach $200 per barrel? Like, how do you see right now? Where do we stand?
Well, thanks for having me. And it's safe to say that you and I and all the others of our peers have been looking at this situation, this precise set of events, years, decades, really going back to the 70s. And when you ask, what are the things that could go wrong in the global oil system? This is really the biggest single point of failure that could go wrong. And right now it's going very wrong. If we looked at the world as it was back in December, early January, I think analysts were expecting overhang of supply ahead of demand, maybe 3 million barrels per day or more. That was disputed by OPEC, but it was, I think, something of an emerging consensus. Now we are losing 20 million barrels per day. And the transit through the strait is only part of the story. The other part of the story, as you mentioned, is production sites. The ability to produce is important if you're going to send it out through the strait, never mind whether you can send it out through the strait. And the market seems to be waking up to this, and the price premium is starting to catch up with some of the targets that most models had started to suggest we would see. But we're still early days. Duration is everything. 140 million barrels, 7 days of shutdown in the strait is equivalent to about 5% of OECD industrial petroleum stocks, give or take. One of the strongest relationships in oil price modeling. And, there are a lot of ways to build oil models, and some of them are right. And that changes, I think, from model to model. One of the strongest relationships, Leslie, is the inverse relationship between price and inventories. And so that draw on inventories is going to matter eventually. Strategic stocks can play a role. We haven't yet seen a coordinated draw, but that could offset some of the impact to price. That requires work and effort to coordinate some of the more reluctant countries. It also requires time. So the Trump administration has looked at mechanisms to free up barrels that are traveling on the open seas. Right now, Russian barrels can go to India for a month on shadow tankers. That sort of approach to this, I think, reflects the necessity to try to supply markets when there's an actual supply shock. So to look at the ranges, when we looked at this, we thought a one week closure might be a $25 per barrel event. And we're getting very close to that $25 per barrel since the event. So I think it rises from there, offset by strategic stocks, demand destruction, and the ability to transit crude through alternate routes, some of which are still available through the pipeline west from Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea, assuming, of course, as you mentioned, that the Houthis leave traffic unmolested, and some capacity from the Emirates to Fujairah in the Sea of Oman. But the limits on that are, when you add up all the strategic capacity, you add up all the alternate route capacity, you still have a gap. And that gap is where demand will balance supply on price, and we're seeing that.
Yeah. So I mentioned in the introduction a historical opportunity, like maybe a window of opportunity. And part of it is because the US now it is big shale producers. There is also more non-OECD supply, like, from the Caribbean. Do you feel that there is still a buffer? And was this sense of, kind of security correct? Like in terms of maybe there will be a temporary spike, but prices will revert fast to where they were because there is ample, abundant supply elsewhere than in the Gulf.
Well, there's a couple of things wrapped up in that, and one of them is the Western Hemisphere contributing to that overall supply stability that you described. I mean, 70% of the barrels that went towards global supply growth over the 15 years through 2025 came from the U.S. on a global liquids volume basis. And of course, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Guyana, a lot of big Western Hemisphere contributions. But those contributions stop really helping once supply freezes in the Strait. What it did is it set the stage for maybe more latency to the supply response, or the price response we're seeing right now. Another thing that probably helped the latency of the price response was the fairly significant energy efficiency gains, the oil intensity reductions that we've seen over the last 25 years in industrialized economies. But those things buy time, they don't prevent the inevitable. And so one of the things that I think is important, you brought this up, is that the context where this war began was one of a well-supplied market. And it's hard to imagine this being on any planner's boards if the market were not as well supplied as it had been prior to the start of conflict. And, as energy security in the United States has sort of provided for economic force projection, as we became bigger producers, more resilient and less reliant on net imports as a share of consumption, eventually in 2019 becoming net exporters on a total energy basis, it became possible to look at targeting major producers, Venezuela in January 2019, Iran, Russia. And that sort of economic force projection is a very different thing from kinetic engagement. And now that we find ourselves in a place with kinetic engagement with economic force projection, we're looking at a world that could tighten very, very quickly. And maybe the last thing to say on that, I think you're getting to this, is there's maybe a broader global picture of which energy is only part. And I think that may be something you're about to get to.
Yes. So let's talk about China. How is China impacted right now by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the targeting of the Gulf facilities, energy production? And above all, like it gets, I think from Iranian oil, maybe 90, more than 90% was heading to China. We know that China is looking at it very closely. What can they do, not do? And China is also becoming a huge producer of both oil and natural gas. They have ample diversification options. Where do they sit right now?
Well, in your introduction, Leslie, you mentioned the sort of the Chinese underwriting of some of those other, I think you call them Axis powers, and the idea that they would be the buyer of last resort for distressed, sanctions discounted barrels, and provide both financing for those producers' economies, but also acquire barrels at a discount that could provide for their own economic well-being. That idea has changed a lot just this year. Venezuelan supply is now going out into the market at something closer to a market price without the deep discounts that China once enjoyed. And the Strait being a source of about 50%, maybe a little under 50% of China's crude slate, is a big problem, a separate problem from the problem of price. Molecules are one thing, price is another. And now they're having both a molecules problem and a price problem. So the Iranian crude and condensate, together about 1.7 million barrels per day on a trailing 12-month basis through February, that is not flowing, obviously, at all. 90% of it, as you say, has gone traditionally to China. And how this turns out, we don't know. It's not clear whether the Venezuela template will apply. I think that may be a big ask, given the very significant differences between Venezuela and Iran. But even if there's a very different formulation in place, China may not be able to count on discounted barrels from Iran anytime soon, or maybe not the same discount once they resume flowing. And then finally, there's the question of the Russian barrels. And sort of implicitly, this creates a bid on those Russian barrels and probably narrows the discounts that China previously could have commanded. And so it's a reason, I think, and it explains well why they have indeed been diversifying not only with their endogenous oil and gas production, but also with the electrification of transit and the effort to try to find a lot of new electricity sources to power that transit. And it's an extremely vulnerable position in which they find themselves. If you look at the sort of the IEA's numbers for total energy supply, and the most recent numbers go through 2024, you'll see that the U.S. went from a 32% net import share of supply country in 2005 to a negative 10%, a net exporter of 10% in 2024. China went from essentially flat, zero in 2000 to about a 25% net import share of consumption, net import share of supply country. So almost the same level of vulnerability where the U.S. found itself at the peak of its energy security concerns. And on an oil market basis, from an oil perspective, they're 75% importers for their consumption. So they have a real, leave climate aside, which I think, the security demands of the moment have led to a lot of climate being left aside. But the climate issue notwithstanding, they have reasons to look at renewables, to look at nuclear, but also very much, yes, to look at their own endogenous production.
So you mentioned that Russian sanctioned oil could go to India on the stop and gap solution, emergency solution. Do you see any other mitigation strategies for large importers of oil from the Middle East? I'm thinking about Europe or Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea. How do they see their options right now?
Well, the most obvious mitigation strategy is one that has limited capacity, much like those seaborne inventories. There's only so much in those ships, and there's only so much in strategic reserves. But if you look at the IEA nameplate for the member countries, there's about 5.2 million barrels per day, maybe a little bit more, in crude capacity available, and about 3.3, maybe a little bit more, in products capacity. Those numbers are a little stale because for a variety of good reasons, I think they're not frequently updated and publicized. In addition to that, there's whatever comes out of the US. But with all of this, there's the latency and there's also the finite nature of stocks versus flows. And in the end, that washes into price. Traders will discount the limited nature of strategic reserves. And when you look at the modeling that was done over the many decades that this risk was anticipated, the duration is everything. When you start to see those reserve coverage numbers dwindling, you get prices rising swiftly. So, the other option remains demand destruction. And I think it's safe to say that the politics of that are ugly throughout most of the industrialized world.
Yeah, on the gas side, LNG side, I also see, especially in Europe, some end users on the industry, chemical side are getting ready potentially for shutdowns of their plants. And I think that gas to coal switching in some Asian economies will be stronger also. But as you mentioned, it all depends on how long it will last. But we're clearly going to see some change of energy mix in various economies, possibly. And
Sorry.
At the end of the day, not beneficial necessarily for climate because, a larger share of coal in some Asian countries will see the results also on emissions.
Well, I think the same thinking we saw in 2022 is happening now in an even bigger way. In 2022, Russian fossil fuel exports, prior to the invasion of Ukraine in February of that year, had averaged about closer to 5.5% of global consumption on an energy content basis. And about 20% of that a little bit more than 5%, came offline as a function of dislocations and sanctions. And what happened was a certain amount of BTU fungibility. The gas that was going to Asia went to Europe. In its place, liquids and coal burned. And you did have differential impacts across the portfolio. They're limited. There's a limit to how much substitution you'll get. But in this case, just the oil and gas alone that traverse the strait are equivalent to about 7% of global consumption on an energy content basis. And so there's a even bigger slice of the pie at risk right now. And to the extent that there are resources that could be drawn, and whatever they may be, you'd expect them to be drawn. The limitations, again, since we think of oil so much as a transportation fuel, the limitations in this case are pretty stark, because if you're short transportation fuel, your option to use liquids as a source of power generation fuel is probably going to be more constrained than it was in 2022. But I think you were getting to another point too, which is that this could leave a mark. I think people who look at energy security think about diversification of sources and routes as one of the watchwords that they've always stood by. And diversifying into other sources and other routes probably will be a consequence of this, even if the crisis is over pretty quickly. Maybe that means some renewable capacity, yes. Maybe that also means a new look at coal, a new thought about coal, where the resource exists and how it can be used. Probably lower 48 LNG, even Alaska LNG, starting to get geographic diversification premia. And so there's probably going to be new thinking on the other side of this.
Mm-hmm. On the LNG side, post-Fukushima, Qatar came to the rescue. Post the Ukraine invasion from Russia, the US came to the rescue. In this big crisis, it might be a more diversified set of, mixed solution, but the US is definitely very well placed and positioned. There are still new energy projects that are ramping up or about to start. But in the immediacy, this is what matters, right? And how long the transit would be closed for the Strait of Hormuz and when can production restart from Ras Laffan would be critical. How long do you think the Strait of Hormuz could be closed? I mean, the West, how long will they? I mean, for me, it's unthinkable that Western powers will leave the strait closed for more than a week.
Well, we're coming up on a week. So yeah. That's an interesting way to frame it. And I think
in terms of credibility, and I mean, we've seen already the Red Sea closed, for almost 3 years, basically to Western ships. Having a second big critical sea lane shut down for a longer period, I think it would be a disaster for the global economy, for inflation, for so many dimensions, but above all, for the deterrence of those nations. And I think France is sending an aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, potentially to reopen the sea lane. The UK is still on the fence, I believe. But, I mean, I think that if it lasts, 2 weeks would be, for me, it's a disaster for the Western world.
So in our models, we've been writing about all sorts of different risks for years, like everyone else, like you. And the scenario that we always modeled was a 1 week closure. And that was predicated on a couple of things. One was the economic pressure you're describing and the use of U.S. military, Western military capabilities to reopen. And there's questions about the nature of the closure. So earlier this week, again, we're talking on March 6th. So who knows what we'll see by the time this even comes out. But the Trump administration looked at one of what I think is well understood to be a root cause of the closure is that the loss of insurance coverage for ships traversing the strait. And the president tasked the Development Finance Corporation with coming up with insurance and reinsurance backstops. That can take some time. I think that it's one of the potential options in the tanker war. If you go back to 1987 and 1988 during the Iran-Iraq war, there was a different insurance capability administered by the Maritime administration that also is available. So a slightly different concept, insurance rather than backstopping private insurance. But there are options available there.
Yeah. Kevin, in other words, it's not Iran that is per se closing the strait, but it's the fact that the Western insurance company have upped so much their war premiums that it's impossible to transit. And also, as long as you have missiles flying around left and right, no Western shipments want to take the risk to transit.
Well, I think that is sort of indirectly or perhaps directly linked to Iran. But the mechanism of action, is particularly the second part you mentioned. I think if you and I have talked a lot to energy company executives, and they always stress the safety of their people. Sea captains have to make a real decision here. Yeah. And it doesn't take much to deter passage. But then there are other questions. So the extent to which the Iranian Navy has been disabled or destroyed limits the capabilities Iran might have to lay mines down. But if they did lay mines down, if there is still some capability, submarines or other capacity, and this is something that I obviously don't know firsthand, we can speculate based on the reports that there might not be much capacity. But the mines could extend the duration of the closure, even if all the other considerations were removed. And so it could well be weeks.
Mm-hmm. Even with a naval escort and, from not just from the US, actually, like if you have different, countries involved in trying, forcefully to reopen the passage.
Yeah, so the naval escorts seem like they would provide pretty significant protection under most circumstances. But these are not most circumstances.
Yeah.
Iran is in an existential moment, and I don't think we can assume that past is prologue. The other thing is that numbers matter, right? This is an era of drone warfare. So Iran has anti-ship missiles, but they also have a very significant supply of drones. And the question is, how many have to get through, even for the naval escort, to fail to adequately protect cargoes?
Yeah, I would mention that the Houthi have been on the sideline until now, and it's really hard to understand their calculation and be in their head. But one thinking is that they may keep the grand finale firework for the end, or they have been deterred, seeing what's happening to the other heads and proxies that have been decapitated. Or some kind of deals that were made back in May between the US and the Houthi is still kind of holding. Many different.
It's a great open question, and it's an important one because we've seen their capabilities, including in 2019, in September of 2019 with Abqaiq. And so there are reasons to wonder whether or not they'll be called in, whether there's escalation. The theory of the case that's come from the administration is that as the war effort proceeds, as the US and Israel are successful at disabling Iranian capabilities, the risks to infrastructure and intuitively passage through the strait should diminish. But it's hard to know where we are in time. And again, if the risk decisions lie on the shoulders of private actors who are looking out for the safety of their personnel, I don't think they're going to try to get too far in front of it.
Yeah. So in terms of long-term energy security implication, we touched a little bit on it. In the event of a complete change of regime in Iran, where you have a pro-American regime or you have a regime that is willing to let the US kind of control their oil and gas, or at least reopen the sector, lifting the sanctions, and a regime that will want to see export revenues, that will want to be reintegrated in the global economy. Do you see what are the implications for oil and gas in the region in terms of investments?
Well, Secretary Wright was speaking about this earlier this year, and he highlighted that there's a fairly significant, a very, very vast conventional resource in Iran. And even with sanctions in place, Iran has been successfully expanding its production. And with Western investment in the capabilities of the best companies in the world, the best technologies in the world, there's room for that expansion to grow and to realize significant output gains over the course of coming years in a model where there's cooperation or alignment after the war. And so I think that the way the administration has framed it is that oil prices will fall and maybe get lower when all this is done. There'll be supply additions, there'll be new resources brought to bear. I think there's a certain amount of latency likely between the end of conflict and the start of Western investment, but there is a long history of Western companies operating in Iran. And so it's not an unthinkable outcome. But there's other political outcomes possible too, including instability within the country that could imperil the existing production and the existing export flows. The idea of sustained civil conflict, instability that prevents investment. And so, I mean, it's an important scenario to consider, and yet it's not the only scenario out there.
Yeah, no, I agree that one scenario that I see also is potential fragmentation and civil war. But that's only one among other scenarios. And in the event of the best case scenario, where we have this kind of change of regime, the mullah are gone, the ayatollahs are gone, more pro-American government, it could be a very positive outcome for also the Gulf countries, because we have the elimination of a threat that was hanging over their heads for several years, decades. And also the security vulnerabilities of these countries around the Strait of Hormuz or around the missiles may also go away. So it could be a very positive outcome for, all the exporters of this region.
It also raises curious questions, some that are, they seem sort of frivolous compared to the gravity of the circumstances where we find ourselves. But one of them is OPEC and OPEC governance in terms of supply management and balancing the market. Venezuela's incentives being aligned with U.S. production goals mean that although it's currently exempt from quotas, at some point, a stable producing Venezuela, growing its production in the ways that have been discussed, would start to raise questions, well, should they be exempting no longer, and what are the quotas? Add Iran to that picture in the salutary scenario you just described, and then now we're asking, well, how does the market management work? Will they be playing for market share as they appear to have been doing since last year? Will they go back to trying to balance the market by curtailing supply? And if they do, what does it mean for the reconstruction and recovery in these countries with such significant production upside opportunity?
Mm-hmm. So we may see the emergence of a competitor, a rival supplier in the region, and that. So in terms of stabilizing the oil markets away from OPEC and more towards what would it be, like a US-led coalition of non-OPEC suppliers that will be willing to stabilize the market?
This is the kind of luxury of hypothetical questions that people with think tank affiliations get to have. But the idea that a U.S. role in dictating the shape of production in these countries subverts or at least competes with the explicit goals OPEC has had in managing supply. That's more of an intermediate term kind of question. And I think really compared to where we find ourselves today, a good problem to have, probably for OPEC and for the West.
Great, Kevin. Well, on this note, I'm moving to a more personal and professional trajectory question. So you've been a long time analyst, speaker, orator, and I was wondering, so your work requires deep expertise, but also the ability to communicate effectively your arguments. And you've just proven that you write very well, you speak very well. You need to do that with investors, policymakers, and the public. So how did you hone those skills over the years? Was it something that you decided to do? I have to become a big speaker, or it came naturally? And tell us a little bit about what advice do you give to younger analysts entering the field?
Thank you for the question. It's not something I talk about very much, but when I was in college, I studied economics, but I also got a second major in English. One of the things my father impressed on me as I was growing up was the importance of writing well. And although an English degree, one can do a lot of things other than learning to write well, one of my focuses was trying to become better at communicating. I had a professor in college who wrote an F on one of my papers, the only F I've ever received on an assignment. And he said, "I will not grade this until you write it again and translate it into the English language. I recommend the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, and other examples of effective communication. I was stunned and shocked, and it was important. It was a seminal moment, and I'm ever grateful for it. The saying that brevity is the soul of wit has never been more apt. We live in such a crowded information world. Everybody's inundated with all sorts of news and analysis, hypothesis, whatever might be coming your way. It's tweeted, it's spoken, it's video. What are you going to do to get through that? When Twitter was 140 characters, it enforced a message discipline to make brevity the soul of wit the absolute watchword. If you go back a few decades, as some of us do, there was a Hallmark cards ad that said, when you care enough to send the very best. The implication was that Hallmark is the very best. Mm-hmm. Well, at ClearView, one of the messages that I have for the team is, when you care enough to say the very least, get directly to the point, say it, and say it without any sort of unnecessary extra stuff. And you have a chance of breaking through. And the last thing I'll say is that the crucible of trying to serve people making important decisions is an excellent way to forge your communication skills. Nothing will hone your ability to get to the point faster than an impatient hedge fund manager who has billions of dollars to think about and no time for your bloviation. And so I've been very lucky to have been encouraged early and reinforced often in that, and I probably went on too long in violation of my own principles.
Well, the point was made, and I think it's a great lesson for all of us. I think I'm from the same school of thoughts, but I think it's always great to hear that being concise, straight to the point, and effective messaging is the best way to deliver your analysis. I agree with that. Great, well, Kevin. Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast. We're both busy. We're going to continue to be busy and following the situation actively, me more on the LNG gas side. So we'll be back with our analysis soon enough.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to join you. And I particularly appreciate our Fletcher connection, as you mentioned.
Yeah, thanks. This episode was recorded on March 6, 2026. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.